Good evening. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrea Pirro, Director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And each year, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a variety of presentations by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars with the mission to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of contemporary art and culture. Throughout its history, the program has served as a critical resource and inspiration for our community. And tonight, we are delighted to welcome Sarah Schulman to campus. I would like to thank Sarah for taking the time to visit our community and for sharing her important work with all of us. I would also like to thank Adam Greatman for his involvement with her visit, as well as the Art Institute of Chicago's Museum Shop for providing Sarah's recent publication, Conflict is Not Abuse, for purchase. If you'd like to purchase the publication, sales will continue in the lobby, and the bookstore representatives will be here after the event, so you can grab a book then if you would like. This evening's program will conclude at 7:30, and central to this presentation is to have open, respectful dialogue and to deepen our understanding of various viewpoints. We encourage you to engage in this discussion during the Q&A portion of the presentation. Our staff will circulate microphones for this purpose. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and our staff will come to you. As with any event, we ask that you maintain respect for your fellow audience members as well as our guest. Immediately following the presentation, we will have a book signing just below the stage, and we'd like you to please line up house right, get your book signed, and then exit house left. And our staff will be on hand to help guide you. So thank you for joining us this evening to help welcome Sarah Schulman to SAIC. And now I'd like to welcome to the podium Adam Greatman, Assistant Professor and Director of the Masters of Arts in Teaching program in the Department of Art Education, and he will introduce our special guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction to the introduction. It's exhilarating to have the chance to introduce Sarah Schulman, our visiting artist scholar this evening. However, I must admit, this is my own introduction to giving introductions. So Sarah, I apologize if this doesn't do justice to the breadth and depth of your work as a novelist, playwright, scholar, activist, filmmaker, and educator. Like a good researcher, I did two things to write this introduction. First, I took out my copies of Sarah's work, from her novels After Dolores, The Child, The Cosmopolitans, and The Mere Future, to her nonfiction work I've used in my teaching and writing, The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination, Stage Struck, Theater, AIDS, and the Marketing of Gay America, and the subject of tonight's lecture, her recently published Conflict is Not Abuse, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair, to her co-produced documentary, United in Anger, A History of ACT UP. I am, as might be apparent, a fan of Sarah Schulman. In taking these out, I looked to see how she was introduced to her readers and viewers through the author's bio. And I learned from the back cover of Israel, Palestine, and the Queer International, Sarah Schulman is a longtime AIDS and queer activist and a co-founder of the Mix Festival and the ACT UP Oral History Project. A playwright and the author of 17 books, she is Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at the City University of New York College of Staten Island. That's all quite impressive. Sarah Schulman wears many hats as an activist, author, and playwright. And in wearing those hats, she draws on the arts, film, personal experience, history, and more to not only make sense of the complex issues in the world, but also to intervene in that world, putting her body on the line. Yet, that bio misses some important things, notably the numerous awards and honors she has received. As we learned from the author bio for her most recent book, her many honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship in Playwriting, a Fulbright for Judaic Studies, and the Kessler Prize for Sustained Contribution to LGBT Studies. And there are many more, of course. But these awards and honors demonstrate that Sarah Schulman is someone who has been recognized as contributing significant things, plays, novels, ideas to the world. Sarah Schulman, we might realize, is a winner, and an honorable winner at that. The second thing I did in researching how to introduce Sarah Schulman was to turn to my own experience finding Sarah Schulman, because I actually just met her today. I first encountered her work as I was doing research for my own teaching in a book project looking at the histories of queer thought. I had a sense, a gut instinct perhaps, that there was a growing and unspoken loss of memory around HIV/AIDS. The epidemic loomed so large in queer histories and politics, yet simultaneously seemed to have been covered over, gotten past. And so I found myself looking for work, looking at HIV/AIDS in our contemporary moment. And it's here I came across the gentrification of the mind, witness to a lost imagination. It was with this work, her intellectual memoir, that I had my sense confirmed as she poignantly taught her readers that AIDS is, and please recognize the present tense here, an American experience. Yet, as so often happens with queer experiences, the experience of HIV/AIDS became relegated to topics, courses, looked at as our past, or worse, looked past as if we'd gotten better in addressing the ongoing and historic realities of HIV/AIDS and its impact on our national memory and ability to mourn. Memory and mourning are complicated, as Schulman argued, because it's hard to have collective memory when so many who were there are not here to say what happened. Fortunately for us tonight, Sarah Schulman is here, and throughout her work, she has sought and continues to document and archive what happened to queer lives as a way to help tilt the world towards what could happen in our shared future. Tonight, Sarah Schulman will ask us to think quite seriously about our shared future as she discusses her new book, Conflict is Not Abuse. The future can, of course, at times these days, look rather bleak. However, as Sarah will argue, we have to stay with our troubles. We cannot look past these troubles. We cannot overstate or overreact to them. Responses that she aptly illustrates as dominating how we are engaging the harms of the world. Rather, we have a duty to repair one another and ourselves, and as she writes in the book, the duty of repair belongs to us all, but especially to those who claim access to a social conscience. We are, I think, a community up for the challenge, and it is with that that I'm happy to bring Sarah Schulman to the stage as part of the School of the Art Institute's Visiting Artists program.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, and I have to say, honestly, I didn't realize how fancy this place was. I thought, I'm going to an art school. So I'm very excited to be here. So what I'm going to do is lay out the fundamental ideas behind this book. It'll take about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to read a little bit and talk a little bit, and then open it up, and we'll have a discussion. But you know, in short, what I'm working with is we're living in a national calamity. We're living in a time when Trump is telling us every day what a victim he is, right? How he's being attacked, and it's so unfair, and it's sad, and he's being abused. Why? Because people are telling the truth about him. So we have this model of somebody with too much power, who's very destructive and unjust. But when we say truthfully what he's doing, we're told that that is abuse. And the flip side is when he manipulates so that a group of people like immigrants who are not responsible for the pain of America, but yet we're told to project our anxiety onto them and to shun them, to exclude them as punishment for a crime they haven't committed. And it's this juxtaposition of people with power presenting themselves as using abuse tropes, and then people who have no power being shunned and excluded from the society because they are made to take responsibility for pain they have not caused. So that is the basic construction that I'm working with. It is a 300-page book, and so I can't explain everything, but I'm going to try to summarize some of the key fundamental ideas. And I just want to start by saying that this is not a book to be agreed with. It is not an exhibition of evidence. It is not a display of proof. It is instead designed for engaged and dynamic, interactive collective thinking, where some ideas will resonate, others will be rejected, and still others will provoke the readers to produce new knowledge themselves. Like authentic, conscious relationships, truly progressive communities, responsible citizenship, and real friendship, and like the peacemaking that all these require, it asks you to be interactive. So the book starts much the same way that a lot of things are starting right now, which is with a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. As I began this book during the summer of 2014, the human community witnessed systemic repetition of unjustified cruelty with exhaustion and frustration. We watched white police officers in Ferguson, Missouri and Staten Island, New York, murder two unarmed black men, Michael Brown and Eric Garner. We watched a rich and powerful professional football player, Ray Rice, beat his wife, Janae, unconscious in an elevator. We watched the Israeli government mass murder over 2,000 Palestinian civilians in Gaza. It quickly became apparent that the methods we've developed collectively to date to understand these kinds of actions in order to avoid them are not adequate. Now, as a novelist, in order to create characters that have integrity, I apply the principle that people do things for reasons, even if they are not aware of those reasons, or even if they cannot accept that their actions are motivated instead of neutral and objective. Using this principle to examine those events, I have to ask myself what the white police officers, the wealthy football player, and the militarized nation state think is happening that produces and justifies their brutal actions. As video and witness accounts attest, neither Michael Brown nor Eric Garner did anything that justified the way they were treated by the police. Eric Garner sold loose cigarettes, and Michael Brown walked down the street. Both men tried to offer the police alternatives to cruelty. Eric Garner informed the police of the consequences of their actions on him when he told them 11 times while in an illegal chokehold, "I can't breathe." Michael Brown raised his hands in a sign of surrender and said, "Don't shoot." But something occurred within the minds, impulses, and group identities of the white police officers in that they construed the original non-event, compounded with these factual and peacemaking communications, as some kind of threat or attack. In other words, these policemen looked at nothing, the complete absence of threat, and there they saw threat gross enough to justify murder. Nothing happened, but these people with power saw abuse. We know from security camera footage taken in a casino lobby and elevator that Baltimore Ravens running back Ray Rice and his wife were having a quarrel. Now, as much as we don't like quarrels with our partners and wish they wouldn't happen, disagreement with one's lover is a normal part of human experience. It is impossible to live without it ever taking place. Intimate disagreement is, as they say, life. Yet Ray Rice experienced normal, regular conflict that exists in every relationship, family, and household in the world as so overwhelmingly unbearable and threatening that he hit his wife, knocking her unconscious, and dragged her limp body by the ankles out of the elevator, leaving her lying inert in the hallway. He looked at normal, everyday conflict and responded with extreme cruelty. He looked at the regular, even banal, expression of difference, and there he saw threat. The Israeli government has kept the Palestinian Gaza Strip under siege since 2005. This has made daily life unbearable for its inhabitants. In the late spring of 2014, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu escalated pressure on the already suffering Palestinians, and some factions within Gaza responded with rockets that were of such poor quality they had only symbolic impact. The Israeli government reacted in turn to this response with over 50 days of aerial bombing and ground invasion, causing mass death and massive destruction of literal, cultural, and psychological infrastructure. The Gazans were reacting to a state of injustice that the Israelis had created. The Gazans were resisting. They were refusing to go along with unbearable and unjustifiable treatment. The The Israelis experienced this resistance to ongoing unfair treatment as attack. Brown and Garner did absolutely nothing but be black. Janae Rice expressed normal conflict. Gazans resisted unbearable treatment. In all of these cases, the police, the husband, and the nation overstated harm. They took nothing, normal conflict and resistance, and misrepresented these reasonable stances of difference as abuse. From the most intimate relationship between two people, to the power of the police, to the crushing reality of occupation, these actors displayed distorted thinking in which justifiable behavior was understood as aggression. In this way, they overreacted at a level that produced tragedy, pain, and division. It is this moment of overreaction that I wish to examine. My thesis is that at many levels of human interaction, there is the opportunity to conflate discomfort with threat, to mistake internal anxiety for exterior danger, and in turn to escalate rather than resolve. I will show how this dynamic, whether between two individuals, between groups of people, between governments and civilians, or between nations, is a fundamental opportunity for either tragedy or peace. Conscious awareness of these political and emotional mechanisms gives us all a chance to face ourselves, to achieve recognition and understanding in order to avoid escalation towards unnecessary pain. However, it is not only the police, wealthy football players, or colonial occupiers who can feel abused in the absence of actual threat. It is not only the dominant who feel endangered when faced with normal conflict or when their own unjust actions are responded to with resistance. In fact, these distorted reactions occur in both the powerful and the weak, the supremacist and the traumatized, in society and in intimacy. In arenas in which real abuse could conceivably take place, there are those who feel persecuted and threatened even though they are not in danger, and they often lack help from those around them to differentiate between the possible and the actual. Bullies often conceptualize themselves as being under attack when they are the ones originating the pain. Everywhere we look, there is confusion between conflict and abuse. If a person cannot solve a conflict with a friend, how can they possibly contribute to larger efforts for peace? If we refuse to speak to a friend because we project our anxieties onto an email they wrote, how are we going to welcome refugees, immigrants, and the homeless into our communities? The values required for social repair are the same values required for personal repair. And so this discussion must begin in the most micro experience. Confusing being mortal with being threatened can occur in any realm. The fact that something could go wrong does not mean that we are in danger. It means that we are alive. So, on a freezing snowy day in 2014, I was invited to a workshop run by a social worker named Catherine Hodes. A native New Yorker in her 50s, Hodes is an experienced professional with over 20 years of development and leadership in what was once known as the battered women's movement, but is now called intimate relationship abuse advocacy. Intimate abuse is a real crisis for New York. In 2014, the police received 284,000 intimate abuse calls, which is about 800 a day. And they made 46,000 intimate abuse arrests. Now, Hodes had boldly started to notice that clients were increasingly confused about what the word abuse actually means. that it was overused. The paradox is, of course, that many women are unable to recognize that they are being abused, and many women cannot get acknowledgement of this reality from others. Yet, at the very same time, Hodes also found that some women were applying the term abuse to situations that were really something else. Increasingly, she noticed that women who did not know how to resolve a problem sometimes described that feeling with the word abuse. So this session had been convened to address that trend directly with service providers. Now, Hodes' focus was to help social workers differentiate between abuse and conflict so that they could be effective and directed in helping clients in ways that would speak to their real experiences. While identifying abuse is essential to saving lives and providing services, differentiating conflict from abuse is also essential to meeting clients' real need to learn how to face and deal with obstacles and to develop truthful assessments of themselves and others. Quote, differentiating between power struggle and power over, Hodes explained, is the difference between conflict and abuse. Abuse is power over, and conflict is power struggle. As we students discussed and grappled with this insight over the course of the day, my understanding consistently deepened. While obviously significant abuse takes place all the time, where one person is being controlled by another or by a group in a manner that the recipient has not contributed to and cannot change, the word abuse has become overused. People may feel angry, frustrated, upset, but this does not mean they are being abused. They might instead be in conflict. Therefore, the fact that one person is truly suffering does not inherently mean that the other party is to blame. The expectation that we will never feel badly or anxious or confused is an unreasonable expectation and does not automatically mean that someone else is abusing us. Now, people may not know how to make things better, how to look at their own participation, how to deal with feeling badly about themselves. They may not know how to understand their own actions and are afraid of the implications of their actions on the meaning of their lives. And this can be devastating, tormenting, and painful. But this is not being abused. It does not get resolved by organizing the punishment of another person. People may be part of negative friendships, families, or communities who attack outsiders instead of being self-critical. They may be receiving encouragement to blame and scapegoat others. They may live within groups, relationships, or families that do not tolerate the admission of mistakes and that reinforce supremacy ideologies about each other in order to maintain illusions of righteousness. This pressure, resulting in the action of collectively deflecting blame, does not mean that the person being blamed is abusive. In fact, it says nothing at all about that person, except that they are being blamed. Now, it was interesting because over the course of the day, Hodes told us that increasingly in cases of abuse, that is to say, power over, perpetrators are grasping at the apparatus of the state and getting control of it. She pointed out that increasingly perpetrators are the first ones to call the police, that they initiate contact with the police, that they threaten legal action. Often perpetrators are the first to send lawyer letters or threaten or seek restraining orders as part and parcel of their agenda of blame and unilateral control. The National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs 2014 report on LGBTQI intimate partner abuse noted that the police misarrest the survivor as the perpetrator of violence in over half of all queer domestic abuse arrests. They're misidentifying the perpetrator in same-sex relationships as the one who is butch, of color, not a mother, not a citizen, from another culture, or HIV positive. So there's a complete breakdown in terms of this legal apparatus. Now, one of Hodes' many valuable suggestions is to lower the bar for what must happen in a person's life for their suffering to be acknowledged. Quote, "The current paradigm is encouraging all of us to think we are in abusive relationships," Hodes explained, "and if you are not in an abusive relationship, you do not deserve help. Being abused is what makes you eligible, but everyone deserves help when they reach out for it." This is a strikingly humane idea, that the collapse of conflict and abuse is partly the result of a punitive standard in which people are made desperate, yet ineligible for compassion. This is a non-cynical reading of a human condition in which people who have suffered in the past or find themselves implicated in situations in which they are afraid to be accountable fear that, within their group, acknowledging some responsibility will mean being denied their need to be heard and cared for. So they fall back on the accusation of abuse to guarantee that they will not be questioned in a way that confirms these fears. Especially vulnerable to this are those who experience profound disapproval and criticism early on as children, who are later locked into self-righteous families or supremacy communities with negative bonds. Ultimately, the blurring of conflict and abuse, Hodes says, quote, "is epidemic and leads to everyone identifying as a victim, which is paralyzing the search for solutions." Now, I was moved and enlightened by her insight that conflicted people have to prove that they are eligible for compassion. No one can negotiate without being heard. Shunning, therefore, is designed to maintain a unilateral position of unmovable superiority by asserting one's status as abused and the implied consequential right to punish without terms. This concept of having to earn the right to have pain acknowledged is predicated on a need to enforce that one party is entirely righteous and without mistake, while the other is the specter, the residual holder of all evil. If conflicted people were instead expected and encouraged to produce complex understandings of their relationships, then people could be expected to negotiate, instead of having to justify their pain through inflated charges of victimization. So at this point, I wanted to understand the history, like how do we get to this place? So I'm just going to summarize a little bit here, my understanding of that. So I was born in 1958 in New York City. And in New York City in 1958, if a woman was raped, she could not get a conviction unless she had a witness. I know it sounds insane, but the woman's testimony alone could not produce a conviction. So in the 1960s, when the feminist movement against violence began, it was at a time when the state was literally the enemy of women, and women did not look to the state for solutions for their problems. Also, that the feminist movement against violence emerged at a time, the 1960s, where there were radical movements all over the world that were radically reimagining our relationships to each other. You know, anti-colonial movements, Black power, gay liberation, women's liberation. And so when you go back to the early documents of the feminist movement against violence, you see that they understood that male violence against women and children was caused by three basic things: patriarchy, poverty, and racism. So they understood it as structural. And what's interesting is their focus was on empowering women, not on punishing men, because they were not looking to the state apparatus. So when you go back to what their programs were, it's pretty much what we would now call restorative justice, even though those words did not exist at the time. So for example, abortion was illegal. They started illegal abortion networks, or they taught self-defense classes, or there were rape hotlines. Like if you were raped, you could call a hotline and a woman who had been raped would get your phone call. So these were all community solutions to problems, and the state was pretty much ignored in that concept. In the 70s, a program began called CETA, where the federal government paid the salaries of grassroots organizations. And these organizations became dependent on the funding, but also the services that they were providing, the demand for services was getting larger and larger and larger. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, which is sort of D-Day to all the problems that we're having now. And one of the very first things he did was eliminate CETA. So a lot of these programs fell apart. Their funding was just gone. Through the 80s, you start to see these services get absorbed by the government. And what happens then is that they're dependent on government funding. People have to get credentialed by the government to work in these things. But there's even a larger state of contradiction because the US government is one of the greatest sources of violence in the world. So if the US government is going to be the force to end violence, you have a serious problem. Because they're not going to be talking about patriarchy, poverty, and racism. I mean, the US government is dependent on patriarchy, poverty, and racism. Instead, you increasingly see this focus on finding the one perpetrator who is completely guilty and incarcerating them. And in order to enforce this, you have the police. Now, we all know what's wrong with the police, but interestingly, police officer is the occupation in America that has the highest level of domestic abuse, even more than NFL players. So police officers are really the least qualified to solve problems. If you're having a problem, that's not the person to go to. So we see this whole focus away from the structural critique and on this thing about turning to the state to find someone to punish. But interestingly, at that same period in the cultural zeitgeist, you see a lot of propaganda for this idea. So this is when things emerge like Law and Order Special Victims Unit. So like in that show, which maybe some of you have seen, week after week, there's one completely pure and innocent victim. Then there's a totally evil perpetrator, and the solution is the police. And this has been the message ever since, that people should not be helping each other de-escalate and solve problems, but actually escalating is seen as good citizenship, and calling the police is seen as appropriate. Now, what I think has happened there is that we get this model where when we abandon accountability for our own participation in creating conflict, we are actually strengthening the power of the state. And in the book, I have 2 case studies of this that I go into great detail, and I'm just going to spend a minute on each of these. One is the 2014 Israeli war on Gaza, which I have I think it's a very interesting history and analysis of that event. But any study of Israeli state rhetoric shows that they rely very heavily on abuse tropes. That they take a subordinated people, the Palestinians, who are in danger, who are endangered, and they're constantly positioning them as dangerous. They are the threat. We are under attack. We are the victims. We are innocent. This rhetoric is pervasive, but actually they are the perpetrators. But another example that I go into is this fascinating contemporary event that's happening globally in our moment, which is HIV criminalization. And what's so interesting about this is that we are at a moment where we have medications where if someone is HIV positive, they can live a normal lifespan if they can have access to the medication. Yet stigma around HIV never dissipates, even though there are plenty of other diseases that are far worse than being HIV positive. The desire to punish people with HIV is ever present. So in what we're seeing in HIV criminalization, which is in Taiwan, it's in Missouri, it's everywhere, is that if you're positive, you're required by law in different places, in America it's state by state, to disclose your status to your sexual partner. Now, what's absurd about this is that if you are positive and you're on the standard of care for HIV, then you're virally suppressed and you're not infectious. You couldn't possibly infect anybody, even if you wanted to. In fact, the safest person to have sex with is someone who's positive and on the standard of care. Safer than, if you're looking to avoid HIV infection, someone who doesn't know their status, for example. Yet that person can be, in many places of the world, incarcerated for not disclosing, even if they're incapable of infecting somebody. And interestingly, one of the worst perpetrators of this is Canada. Now, do not be fooled by Canada, people. I don't know why they have such a good reputation. But actually, they have one of the worst HIV laws in the world. And when I started researching for this book, I did a piece for Slate magazine just focusing on HIV criminalization in Canada, where 250 people have been incarcerated under this law. Regardless, it has nothing to do with infecting other people. It's only about the issue of disclosure. So being a good journalist, my first question was, who are these 250 people? And when I looked at it, I found out that half of them were black. Now, this is Canada. Like, there's not a lot of black people in Canada, okay? It's 2%. So if 50% of the people incarcerated under a law are black, you understand that this is an anti-immigrant racist measure. But for our purposes, it also illustrates this other structure, which is that they've taken the category of HIV negative. Now, HIV negative people for 30 years have been conceptualized as people who have the responsibility to keep themselves negative. But the government is saying, oh, you're not responsible. You are potentially criminally wronged. See, they create a relationship of dependency. So any anxieties you have about sex, about HIV, instead of trying to encourage you to work out your anxieties so that you don't project them on your partners, we're going to actually escalate those anxieties so that if you have sex with someone who didn't disclose their status, even if you didn't get infected, you should pick up the phone and call the police. So what they do is they create a whole new class of people, HIV negative people, who now have the power to incarcerate a whole new class of people, HIV positive people. And I think that what this illustrates, and my thesis here, is that when we abandon accountability for our role in conflict, we enhance the power of the state. Okay, thank you very much. So now I want to hear your objections and questions, comments, anything that you want to say. And these lovely people have microphones. There's someone over there.
Hi, I've been waiting to talk to you ever since I read your book. Because it resonated with me on so many levels and challenged me on so many other levels. So I loved it and hated it and loved it and hated it. And I'm an art therapist and I work in prison systems, and social justice spaces are familiar to me. And what I loved about your book was that it was one of the first that's showing us how to bridge the personal and the political, both being so nuanced, both being so challenging. I mean, as an individual artist and a practicing therapist. So, and then at the end of the book, you talk about also meditation practices, and you quote somebody. I mean, you go to someone's workshop and you show us Buddhism and strategies from Buddhism to kind of de-escalate one's own trauma in the moment, if I'm getting it right. But this one thing that I was really confused about is where is the trauma-informed perspective in labeling what is conflict and what is abuse? Because as a therapist, I know that what is abusive for one person is not at all abusive for another. What is conflicting for one is not. And I'm often seen as the one trying to do too much repair, and that's why your book was so great, because you have that too, that label. But I'm really missing the trauma piece.
Okay, so you're raising like so many different things. I'm going to try to address some of them if I can remember them all. So the first thing is regarding meditation. I'm not advocating meditation. I just want that to be clear. What I did was I did a comparison between 4 systems that I think are very, very different. Mid-century psychoanalysis, contemporary pop psychology, mindfulness, and Al-Anon. And what I showed is that even though these systems are are against each other in many ways, or they all drew 2 of the same conclusions. That they all recommend, doesn't mean that I recommend, but they recommend, when faced with conflict, delay. They all recommend delay. You know how like the person writes you the mean email and then you like write it right back and then you press send? They recommend not to do that. They recommend to think it over and talk it over with other people and think before you respond from a place of being upset. And the second thing that they recommend is the positive group. Because a lot of our problems are caused by being in negative groups. Whether it's patriotism, nationalism, racism, Jewish supremacy, whether it's on that level or whether it's our mean little cliques, right? Where it's like your friend broke up with her girlfriend, so your whole clique is going to shun that person forever. You know, all the different groups that we identify with negatively, where we think that we express loyalty by bonding to hurt somebody. And so all of these systems recommend the positive group, whether it's the 12-step meeting, the meditation group, the relationship with the therapist, whatever, a place where you can go to think about actually how to repair, how to negotiate, how to engage, instead of how to hurt the person and how to organize your community to hurt them or exclude them. So that's what the mindfulness section, that was the function that it served. Okay, so let me try to get to the next. Oh, yeah. So one of the things, I'm not sure, do you want to restate a little bit what you're most focused on? Because you raised so much.
Sorry, I was so excited to see you, so I said everything at once. The trauma-informed perspective is what I was missing and confused about, and the
Right.
labeling of what is conflict and what is abuse.
Okay, thank you. So there's two things I want to say about that. So Catherine Hodes is a kind of a really interesting person. You know, she worked in violence in New York City for many years. And so one of the methods that she used for differentiating between power over and power struggle, and let me just say that it's not like two separate worlds. There's gray zone. Like anything that we want to address in life with some maturity and intelligence, we have to acknowledge that there's gray zone. And gray zone is where all the interesting things happen. But one of the things she does with a client is says, tell me the order of events. And very quickly, she can see whether it's conflict or abuse. Now, the thing is, we should all be like overjoyed to find out that the feelings of victimization that we're having, if it's actually conflict, that actually we're contributing to the problem, because then we can change it. But we don't feel that way. Because right now, if anyone takes responsibility for participating in creating the problem, they get blamed. And then they get rejected, and then they get punished. When actually, they should be welcomed with, hugs and kisses for taking responsibility for their role in the conflict. So the way we've got it set up now is only if you are 100% the pure victim can you get any love. And so we're being pushed into these extremes of understanding ourselves as helpless when sometimes we're not, and sometimes we are. Because right now, the marker that you're being listened to, when a person is in authentic pain, we measure whether or not we're being heard if the person who we think hurt us gets punished. If they get punished, then we think we're being heard. Because all of our focus is on figuring out who is the perpetrator so that they can be punished. However, if our focus was on trying to understand what happened, if our end goal was to try to understand what happened, then we would have more room to say how we participated in creating the problem, because we wouldn't be rejected for saying it. So that's part of it. The other is, and I just want to say, I'm not an academic, okay? And this book doesn't have footnotes, and I can't prove any of this. And there's a lot of ideas in here, and some of them are wonky, and I admit that. But I think the best idea that I have in here, the thing when I came up with this, I was like, wow, that is really good, is when I recognize that supremacy and trauma are mirror images of each other. And let me go into that, and I think that this addresses a little bit of what you're raising. Like when the supremacist person feels entitled to not only never be questioned, but to never have to question themselves. They feel like that's their right. And when we question them, or we ask them to question themselves, they think they're being abused or attacked, right? I think we're all familiar with that model. But for those of us who are traumatized, sometimes it's so hard to just keep it together, that to even further feel even more critical of ourselves just feels impossible. We just feel like we're going to fall apart. And so somebody else who might just be simply different, their difference or their different perspective, or them asking us to question ourselves can feel so overwhelming that it feels like an attack. And in this way, the supremacist and the traumatized person can both feel that they're being attacked simply by the presence of difference. And I just want to say also that sometimes they're the same person. I recognize that as well. But like, for example, and this is like a very gray zone thing, but we're all interested in sexual abuse and sexual harassment right now, and hopefully from now on, and it's becoming a public discussion. And there are some things that pretty much everyone agrees are sexual abuse, but then there's these gray zone areas. And sometimes there are things that happen where two people could have the exact same experience, and one person can find it so damaging and wounding that they're devastated for the rest of their life. And the other person can be like, oh well. And the question is, why do these two people experience the same thing so differently? And it's because they have different histories, right? And so we need to have our pain acknowledged in an individuated way based on our histories, so that if one person is devastated and the other person isn't, we don't say to the devastated person, hey, that guy isn't, so what's wrong with you? No, because what it teaches us is that we can't just go around with one standard of what things are, of what is wounding, of what is okay, of what is resilience, of what is protection. We have to listen to people and make evaluations based on what they have to say. And in order to do that, we have to ask them, what do you think is happening? But right now, globally and intimately, we are encouraged to shun. We have the Muslim travel ban, we're deporting immigrants, America first, all this stuff that's happening on that level, the separation wall in Israel-Palestine, but it's also very common just in our intimate relationships to shun people. When actually we should be having more conversation and more communication, not less. Like, I am shocked by how often I'm asked to hurt somebody. Like, people are like, why did you invite her? Why are you working with him? You shouldn't do that. No, it's like we need to hear what each other has to say. It can't be so terrible to be exposed to difference that we're going to fall apart and be devastated if we hear something from someone else that we wish they didn't think or feel. And my model for this is one of my heroes, Sarah Ahmed, who is very good on this. If you read her book, I think it's called The Purpose of Happiness. It's an amazing book. And she talks about how, in bourgeois cultures, there's this concept among the bourgeoisie that we have the right to never be uncomfortable. And that if we're ever uncomfortable, we're being abused, and we're being attacked, and we're threatened. But actually, the only way you can go through life without ever being uncomfortable is at somebody else's expense. It's only if other people are repressed. So we need to be uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is the healthy state. And therefore, we shouldn't be shunning people. We should be hearing what people have to say. So that's my very long answer. Yes, over there.
I was going to wait for the microphone, but I think I can project loud enough for the room. I wanted to first just thank you for coming and speaking to our school. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm really excited to pick up a copy. One of the things that I picked up from just the summary that you gave us was this idea of transformative justice and this idea of being proactive instead of reactive. Oh, hey, cool. Hi. And so one of the things I was thinking about was, as you mentioned, like shunning or excluding in spaces, and I was wondering if possibly you could talk about solutions or frameworks or dispositions to approach situations where it's understood that there will be a social situation where a known abuser is present, and like how to handle that. Or let me rephrase. How to not exclude, how to bring community together when one person has been known to have wronged another, I suppose.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would have to say is I'd need to know the specifics. Because, I think the point I just made before was that sort of generic answers, they don't apply, and we have to understand who people are and what's involved. But one of the things that we've been learning last week is that there's a huge amount of perpetrators. There's an enormous number of perpetrators, right? So as a society, we have to learn how to deal, especially with male offenders. The strategy of excluding every male offender or incarcerating them or socially excluding them, I don't think it's practical. We have to find a way to address it. So if you look, for example, at the Columbia University case, so the argument, I understand the argument. A student is going to Columbia, it's a female intellectual, she's been sexually assaulted by a male student, she doesn't want to have to see him on campus. I completely understand that. But once he's expelled, where does he go? He doesn't fly up to the clouds. He goes out into the world of women who don't go to Columbia University. In other words, this strategy of expelling people from the country club so that we in the gated community are safe from them is not a solution. It's a class-based solution, but it's not a social solution. Rich institutions like Columbia have the means to try to find ways to address male offenders, and it has to be addressed. So I don't see that removing every person who's been a perpetrator is a solution, a practical solution. This is not an ethical position. I'm not saying this for moral reasons. I'm not a peace and love person. I'm not like a Buddhist or anything like that. This is completely practical. And also, just, all my life, I'm 59, I have never seen an example in life where punishment works. I just don't think punishment is successful. So those are my thoughts. I think the answer lies in the community, that communities have to help each other adjust instead of just drawing walls around little cliques or around religious or racial groups or nation groups and excluding and punishing everyone who doesn't fit in. Look what the state that we're in. It's not working as a strategy. I can't see you, so you guys just will have to give people the mic.
I was particularly interested in your point of LGBTQA relationships where the minority gets blamed. And being in a mixed race relationship, I'm wondering what strategies to deal with trauma when there's like a culturally different way to dealing with conflict with your partner, and sometimes like the ways that you grew up with to resolve conflicts are traumatic for them, but also if you are to be put in a situation, the police will find you as the perpetrator. When like we have like historically and like ritual ways of different dealing with it.
Yeah, I understand.
And what strategies do you recommend?
Well, I mean, look, the state's job is to reinforce the power of the state. That's what the state does, okay? And so that means certain people are going to be treated differently by the state than others, and we understand that. And the lesson of this fact that half of all queer domestic abuse arrests, they arrest the wrong person, because if they're both of the same gender, they can't tell who's the perpetrator, shows you that that system is not working for those people. Now, I mean, like, if I was being stabbed, I would want the police to, stop it. But it's like, if someone stole my cell phone, I wouldn't necessarily want to call the police. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like some things really, truly are an emergency where you need an intervention right that second, but a lot of things aren't. So if you feel that you're not going to get justice by going to the state apparatus, then you have to go to your community. We just need people to help. We need to help each other de-escalate and negotiate. And it doesn't mean we're all going to be friends at the end. Like, this is not utopian here. This is not like a hippie thing. What I'm looking for is like agreement about what our different positions are. So like, if I'm going to fight with you, I want to be able to say what your position is in a way that you can recognize as accurate. And I want to hear from you that you really know what my position is in a way that I can recognize as accurate. And maybe that's all we can get. And then that's just it. We both agree with what each other thinks. But that's better than what we have now. Go ahead. Mary Patton right here.
Hi,
Hi, Mary.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. So one of the things we're not talking about explicitly right now, which is kind of raging all over the place, is what do we mean by this notion of safe space on campuses and in classrooms, and how we are broaching and mediating differences? And I think the work that you're doing is really crucial in this, and I hope that we can find a way here, and probably already are, you know, from the discussion, to take lessons from it. And you welcome conflict, right? You said that in your introduction. But it's interesting, this is I don't go to them all, but this is the first visiting artist program lecture I've been to in some time where there was almost a kind of, not disclaimer, but a kind of advisory about people needing to respect each other, which, you know, I think we all agree, or we say we agree. And I think that was, I'm guessing, I wasn't a part of that, but that it was anticipatory of some conflict, probably, my guess, is in terms of Israel and Palestine. That's just a wild guess. But, you know, I think it would be really healthy, and you're encouraging for us to get to it a bit, because for me, the notion, I used to have this notion that the classroom, because I've been a teacher for a really long time, that the classroom, a safe space in the classroom is because it was safe to have conflict in a respectful manner, and not to, I mean, I just think there's a lot that we can say also as an institution amongst ourselves, and should afterwards, and it's going on already, about the way we negotiate these things. And it also goes back to James Baldwin, who said, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's basically the end of safety is the beginning of knowledge. Anyway, so it's just like, let's talk, people.
There's so many different ways. I mean, you just raised like so many different things. As you can tell, I'm very precise. So like when there's like 10 things, I kind of don't know how to jump in. But, okay, I mean, terrible things do happen in classrooms, right? There's racism in classrooms from professors. There's sexism, there's transphobia, there's homophobia, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, I dropped out of the University of Chicago 38 years ago because a teacher said, we all know female students contribute nothing to a classroom situation. All right, so that is there, and it's very dangerous. But usually a classroom is not a site of physical or sexual abuse. It's rare, if that is ever the case, it's so rare that I don't even know about it. What it is a site of is discomfort. And as you know, I'm a big fan of discomfort. And I think it's necessary because it helps us figure out who we are and what we believe in, sometimes by negative example. Now, it's interesting because in my school, which is the opposite of this school, I teach at the City University of New York College of Staten Island, and we have a 30% graduation rate in 8 years, just so you understand. We did a survey of the faculty. Not one student has ever asked for a trigger warning in the history of our school, except someone who wanted to be told if we were going to say that the Bible was not the Word of God. So concepts about safety are very, very particular to class, to race, to immigration status, what people think is safe, what people think is not safe. And we're talking about in a realm of ideas. So I'm going to posit, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, go back to Sarah Ahmed, that those of us who are the most comfortable are the ones who feel the most put upon when we're asked to be uncomfortable. And I just think that that's a harsh thing, but I think that it's accurate. And it's just something to grapple with. So, I believe in the open classroom. I teach fiction writing. And my rule in my classroom is that there's no censorship of any kind. Students can use any language. They can create any situations. But if other students don't like it, the writer has to hear what that person has to say about it. And that's it. Okay, the hands are up, right over there.
Hello.
Hi.
So I don't know you that well. I don't know most of your work. This is my first time meeting you. Nice to meet you. And I'm very curious about what you have to say about the lack of punishment, or how punishment may or may not work. And I guess in the social circle I'm around, there's someone that's known to be domestically violent and sexual assault people, and there's this belief, which has been mentioned on Law & Order SVU, that someone who sexually assaults someone will do it again. And I believe that the social ostracization of these people also doesn't work, because then they're left to go find people that agree with them. But how do you talk to them about what they're doing, and how do you address punishment or lawful recognition of what they do so that they don't continue to do it? Yeah.
Okay, so let me just say that Beth Ritchie, who is a local Chicago genius, I use a lot of her research in this book, because she shows that the current legal apparatus that we have constructed to deal with domestic violence is basically being used against poor men and men of color, leading to increased incarceration. It is helping the state have more access to invading poor families, and that at the lowest socioeconomic level of the poorest women in America, their rate of experiencing violence has not declined, even with this heavily constructed legal apparatus. So that's, the structural reality there. Now, I don't have an answer for you about what to do about male offenders, but I know that there's a lot of people who are trying to figure that out. I know that there's like a program in the state of Iowa that people are having a lot of success with that has to do with idea replacement and things like this, But I think that a place like a wealthy university is a good place to try some of those ideas, because we have to deal with it. Because whatever the concept of incarceration means that only a certain class of people are being affected, and it doesn't help them. It makes their lives worse, and it destroys their communities even more. So, we just have to deal with male offenders, and that's not my arena. I could do a whole other book on all the different programs that are out there and different ideas that people have, and I'm not an expert in that, but that's where my leaning is. Yes, way in the back.
Hello.
Or whoever, yeah.
Oh.
Anyone is fine. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Hello, I've gone through emotional trauma, and I never called it abuse. I called it a toxic relationship. Where would you place a toxic relationship? Is it abuse, is it conflict, or is it like in between?
Well, I would have to know the specifics, but don't tell me right now. But I really think that these things are based on specifics. But the most important thing is not whether it's a toxic relationship or abuse or conflict. The most important thing is that if you're in pain, you should be heard and treated with compassion without having to say that you're entirely innocent and everything was done to you in order to be heard. I'm just saying, bring down the bar for who you need to be to have somebody pay attention to what you're saying about yourself. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Hi,
go ahead.
I'm Mary. Thanks for coming.
And then Claire. Yeah.
One thing that you said in your book, it was small but mighty. You said the power of talking to somebody on the phone, like calling them instead of texting them or emailing them. And I thought maybe you could talk about that just for
Right.
everybody.
The thing, you send an email and then the other person answers you, and then you think that they're dissing you, and you don't like the tone, but you're not really sure, and then you write back, and then they're in a hurry, and the next thing you know, you're not friends anymore. Anyone know what I'm talking about? That's insane, people. That is crazy. If you have a bad email with somebody, pick up the phone and ask them, why do you think this is happening? as soon as, these people who shun you, I don't know if you've ever been shunned, but someone who shuns you for days, weeks, months, or years, and then one day they have to talk to you and suddenly everything's fine. Because all you needed was that human affect and just that humanity of being physically with each other to straighten out some of the problems. It doesn't fix all problems, but this idea of blocking people on Facebook, I love Facebook, and I have 15,000 people follow me on Facebook, and I don't block anybody, no one. Because one day I was like, God, this person is writing this thing, because I'm pro-Palestinian, right? So people write, you're a Nazi, you would put your grandmother in a boxcar, I get all that stuff, the crazy stuff. And I thought, so what? One day I was just like, this person wrote this crazy thing, and I was like, so what? Just ignore it. It'll scroll down eventually. You don't have to block them. I would just like to invite everyone to go home and unblock everybody that you've blocked. Seriously. So what if someone says something you don't like? Big deal. You know, we're in a world of other people. And that's like, so I just think that these technologies where there's no affect and you really don't know what the other person's feeling, they're just they often cause a lot of pain. Now, however, I was critiqued on this idea by younger people, particularly this one very, very smart woman, Merit Kopass. I don't know if people know her work. And she was like, you know what, you're old, Sarah. She didn't say it that way, but I didn't grow up with these technologies. I came to them, I mean, they happened as I was already an adult. But that, her claim was that people who are younger and have developed socially with them handle them better. What do you think? Yes. Okay. So, that is a critique that I've taken in, that I do have a generational bias. But I still think go home and unblock people. Why not, right?
There's a question.
Okay, Claire, right here. Yeah. Right, Claire. Yeah. Yes, you, right there. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. I think we've come to expect of you that you're brave enough to take these things on, and I really appreciate it. What I'm thinking about is what you said, that the people who are made uncomfortable are usually the ones who have benefited by other people's disadvantage or abuse or whatever.
I didn't say that, but anyway,
okay.
Go ahead. But that's what you heard. That's fine. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me put it this way, that, I'm thinking about Microaggressions and Claudia Rankine, who did a lot to bring an idea that someone else had made up, had named, into consciousness. And I think, someone like Claudia Rankine, when she talks about her discomfort, I don't think it's from a lifetime of expecting the world to never make her uncomfortable.
Right.
It comes from a totally different place. And
that's why I didn't make that point.
Well, I got it wrong. I'm going to give you a chance to restate it.
Okay. Let me just say that I'm on the board of Claudia's the Racial Imaginary Institute, and she did actually blurb this book, my book. Okay. So we're kind of on the same page. No, I'm saying that sometimes bourgeois people feel that they have the right to always be comfortable. And sometimes we feel that if other people's difference makes us uncomfortable, that they're attacking us or abusing us. But actually, in a healthy society, we are uncomfortable because we're with difference. Now, I'm not erasing in any way people who are uncomfortable because they're being victimized by racism or by structural oppression. That's because I'm talking about conflict, and that would be abuse. Okay.
And then I just wanted to follow up with a question about microaggressions, because it seems like at the school, there's a lot of sensitivity, right? Which I think is way beyond our school. But, and it seems like people are reacting to like a whole history of structural inequality. But an individual gets blamed because they are also part of that big structural thing. And it seems like it's really hard to take it from, you said this to me, and you're insensitive, and you are just wrong-headed, to a place where we're analyzing how we're all been part of a structural arrangement that benefits a particular group.
I'm not a fan of that point of view, because of the benefits of whiteness that we're all aware of, and the idea that the whiteness doesn't reside in individuals and that it's only structural, I think is a mistake and untrue. And in most of these institutions, they are controlled by white people, and not all. I mean, I know that here, for example, you have a new dean who is black, but in most institutions, the upper administration is white. So even if there's an echelon of people of color who don't have power, but have a lot of social responsibility, the power is still in white hands. So I guess the question is always, who has the power? How is it being expressed? And what are concrete ways to try to disrupt it? Obviously, no institution can completely successfully disrupt it because it's in a white supremacist society. Or we understand that, but that doesn't make white people off the hook.
Well, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I was just more asking for how do we go beyond playing our roles.
How do we go beyond playing our roles? That's a fantastic question. I guess start with that. I think that's a great place to start. Well, if we could each be honest about what our role actually is, without the fear that if we say how we're complicit in creating the problem, that we're going to be punished. Because that's why we're hiding how we're complicit. If we could actually do it, not in this, mea culpa way, but in a real way, then we can see some possible structural transformations.
We have a question up here.
Okay, I think that's the last question, yeah, because we're out of time. One last question. Oh, okay.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for coming. My question, first I wanted to say something about the uncomfortability, and often that is referring to like white fragility, and how free speech is often used as a shield, so though their words are free to harm identities. My question would be, how should communities be holding people accountable?
How should what?
How should communities be holding people accountable? Because it's been my experience that whenever communities begin to organize, they become systematized and then fall into like an abusive space.
Well, I think it depends on the specifics. I'm not sure that there's a generic answer, but I think we can start by asking everyone, why do you think this is happening? And make sure that everyone gets to speak and no one is excluded. But I want to get back to the first thing you said, which is the free speech debate. What concerns me, and maybe this is a good place to end on this, I'm looking at the resistance, the anti-Trump resistance, and we're seeing that certain communities are getting really mobilized, right? Yes, there was that big women's march. The Dreamers are unbelievable. They're just totally leading. Black Lives Matter is out there. But where are the students? I find that the student movement is inert. And I find it very disturbing, because I'm going from campus to campus, and the thing is, students helped end the war in Vietnam. They were one factor in ending that war. And yet here, I don't see the student movement stepping up. And one of the things that's concerning about that is that student leaders become the leaders. That's the place where people train and whatever. So what I see instead is this focus on stopping fascists from speaking. And I know that that is a controversial strategy. I personally, it's not my strategy. I wouldn't condemn somebody else for doing it, but it's not where I would go. But what I worry is that that is substituting for students saying what you do want. What is your vision of a better society? What do you believe in? What are you fighting for? What are your goals? That's what I want to hear. And I'm afraid that the free speech debate is becoming a way of, it's a misplaced debate, because what we really should be talking about is what kind of world do we want to live in, and what do we think are good ways to get there? And let's end on that. So thank you all so much.